Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. This is now our third lecture in Module 4, dealing with the topic of global business. And as you can see from this title slide, today's lecture is trying to get organized around the whole complexity of global business. What has the world community done to try to provide some sort of set of order and some set of universal rules and procedures to ease international trade amongst nations? Well, let's go set the Wayback Machine for 1944 at the tail end of World War II. At the tail end of World War II in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, all of the Allied nations, all 44 of them, sent delegates to talk about what would the world economy and international trade look like as soon as World War II was ended. By the time that Bretton Woods happened in 1944, it became clear that the Allies would inevitably win World War II, and so they were trying to set up an orderly way for nations to have trade with one another. So what would be some ways and some mechanisms that would ease that to help the world recover from the devastation of World War II? Some of the things that were set up at Bretton Woods was the International Monetary Fund, which is now part of the World Bank Organization. And those kinds of agreements led to GATT in 1948. GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, some very, very important agreements among nations to try to provide organized procedures for international trade. Now, by the time we get to 1994, 123 nations from around the world have agreed to establish the international organization known as the World Trade Organization. The WTO, or the World Trade Organization, exists for these three primary purposes. When you think about nations trading with one another: to promote trade by encouraging member organizations, member nations, members of the World Trade Organization, to promote trade by encouraging WTO members to adopt fair trade practices, to treat each other fairly. We'll talk about that a little bit, just a sec. In addition, the middle bullet point there, to reduce trade barriers between countries by promoting multilateral negotiations. And third, to establish fair procedures for resolving disputes among WTO members. So let's talk about this for a moment. Why is advancing international trade good, especially under the shadow of a world war just ending? Well, because most nations and world governments understand if your country is doing an awful lot of continuing business with companies and citizens from another country, then it's in your best interest, it's in everybody's best interest not to go to war. It's in everyone's best interest when inevitably conflicts and disagreements come up to resolve those things rather than get your underwear in a twist and start picking up guns. Everyone understands that if there were organized ways to promote international trade, then people would be much more indebted and understand each other better across international borders, and people would be far more incented to resolve their differences rather than go to military violence. That's the reasons why. Now, when you look at what the WTO has tried to do as a result, you can see here the WTO has tried to set up fair trade practices, has tried to promote multilateral negotiations, and has tried to provide at least some sort of process to resolve disputes among members. So how is the WTO done as an organization? If we were a grading agency and we're about to give the WTO a report card, what grade would we give them if these three items on that slide are what the WTO is all about? Well, to be perfectly frank, we would probably give the WTO a grade of C, C minus, at best a C. They haven't done anything better than that. They haven't been able to accomplish A work or B work, quite frankly, and there are several reasons for that. Probably the biggest reason is simply this. For all the best of intentions that the WTO has, it has no teeth. It can't enforce any of these processes, rules, trade practices, procedures. It can't even really enforce the final decree of the dispute resolution process because it has no police force. And therefore, what has typically happened in international trade is this. Typically, disputes and problems arise between very large countries and much smaller countries. Much smaller countries typically have only a few things to offer to the table of international trade, typically agricultural products. Whereas big industrialized countries have all sorts of products to offer into the international marketplace, including manufacturing, automobiles, chemicals, etc., etc., etc. And so what has many times happened is that when, for instance, the small country has been sort of the violator, the big country has said, hey, WTO, you need to enforce these rules or we're not going to do business with them anymore. It's not fair. And of course, the small company, under the auspice of the big WTO coming down on them, many times will knuckle under. However, what has typically happened next is when the big country has been the offending party and the WTO comes in and says, hey, you got to stop doing that. This is not fair. This is in violation of our principles. The big country, developed country, the wealthy, rich country, like the United States, we have done this several times, we will simply say, hey, make us. We're going to call your bluff. We dare you. We double dare you. Because what have we got to lose as a big wealthy country? And that has been really what has, left the WTO, unfortunately, largely impotent in its efforts to promote international trade, at least any of these kinds of practices and procedures you see on the previous slide. At best, we'd give them a C. As best, we'd give any organization that has tried to promote international policy making that doesn't have any real enforcement. As a result, what we've seen instead, since the WTO doesn't really seem to be able to work, is we have seen trade agreements and alliances form between nations in geographically congruent regions. So for instance, we have NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. There are 3 countries in NAFTA: United States, Canada, and Mexico. Yes, the 3 countries in North America. Okay? So when anybody asks you, or if I ask you on a quiz or a midterm exam, right, what are the countries in NAFTA? United States, Canada, and Mexico. That's the largest trade alliance that we belong to, trade agreement. You also have the European Union, right? Among the major European nations, this agreement they have, that also embraces a common currency, as well as eliminating most, if not all, of the trade barriers between member nations. And we have, significantly smaller than either the EU or NAFTA, but still important, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. You see that there. It is an organization for cooperation amongst Southeast Asian nations, an important but much smaller body compared to the first 2. Those are still in existence. Those generally have been successful in not only lowering trade barriers, but also promoting mutual welfare for all of the countries involved in these trade agreements or associations. And that is something that perhaps you have heard disputed reports and summaries about, depending on where you get your news. There are some folks in the United States who would tell you, hey, NAFTA has been the worst thing for the United States. It needs to be adjusted and repealed, etc., etc., etc. However, I would suggest you consider the data seems to indicate clearly, unabashedly, unequivocally, that trade between nations, United States, Canada, and Mexico, has grown exponentially after the passing of NAFTA, and that companies and consumers in all three nations have largely benefited from NAFTA, and only in some few isolated sectors are people hurt or injured by the outcomes of NAFTA. Now, that's not to say that people haven't been set back by some of the consequences of NAFTA. You have to understand, any time that you have changes in business, especially changes in international trade, which are the result of uniform policy established by an outside organization, a trade agreement like NAFTA, you will have winners, and anytime you have winners, you will typically have losers as well, right? The only question in business when you have winners and losers is what you gain with the winners worth what we lose with the losers? That's really the net question. This is the question with any sort of innovation and change. Think about this for a moment, right? Nowadays, everybody has a cell phone, which is a wonderful thing unless your company built products that focused upon the home telephone. Remember when we all used to have home telephones? Right. If somehow you were, for instance, a big manufacturer of home telephone answering machines, then this whole change in innovation towards a smartphone has probably left you screaming for revenue. You really have had a bad way. Would you be willing to go back to a world in which none of us had smartphones? We all had to rely on the little answering machine tied into our home phone? Probably not. But that's a decision we made as a marketplace, right? That for the sake of the winners, what we gain, we're willing to live with the losers. The same is true with NAFTA and any international trade agreement. What is gained and what is lost. And the data does very strongly suggest that all the players are more winners than losers. In fact, most trade agreements, this is probably true. So these are at least a very, very brief survey of some of the major players who have tried to create policy and organization when we talk about promoting international trade. The last three, the trade alliances and agreements we talked about there, generally speaking, pretty successful. World Trade Organization, not so much, right? But again, it gives you sort of a sense for some of the attempts to organize international trade amongst the global community and where we've ended up. So I hope that's helpful. We'll see you in the next lecture.